And thanks everyone for coming on this rather brisk and snowy morning afternoon. We have been experiencing the weather with a little bit of trepidation, but I think that we are surviving. So I thought I would start by explaining how it is that we got here to this point. And it was actually the result of a certain conjunction of things. It was in the fall of 1917. Renato and Mary were staying in Albuquerque like they do every fall. And we were visiting, and like we do. And so there was that. And we were having dinner at my house with them and my partner. And of course, this was shortly after the election of Donald Trump as the president of the United States. So it was probably kind of rare, but we talked about that a lot. So because we're sort of geared that way.
Let me mention, before we talked, I'd been crying for several weeks.
There was tequila involved.
And so, you know, we talked about the spectrum of things political that have arisen, that arose so immediately on both the campaign and the election of Trump. And so there was that ongoing discussion. At the same time, I had noted that the School of Advanced Research had put out a call for advanced seminar with a Latino focus. And so I pitched the idea of our putting together a proposal that would create a seminar and that would feature the situation of people of Mexican origin, which is a very general sort of term, and one that we think is probably appropriate for a title that would go with the seminar. Of course, what that means in the real world is one of the things that we've been talking about during this whole week. But so that was the theme that we thought might be viable for a seminar. And so we got to work and we put the proposal together, and we spoke about the possible participants. When you write the proposal, you don't have to name specific people that are going to be in the seminar, but we had names that we could suggest to the program, and we did this in time to get it into the hopper by the deadline. Well, lo and behold, it got supported, it got funded, it got approved, and so then the work began of identifying the specific people who we would want to have to be the participants to talk about what we decided should be a major theme of citizenship in relationship to Mexicans, Mexican Americans, people of Mexican descent, under the pressures that were being placed by the Trump administration. And of course this made sense given Renato's and his colleagues' work regarding cultural citizenship. And we built we constructed the proposal around the theme of citizenship because of that work that Renato and his colleagues and other people, and a growing number of people who were starting to talk about Latina citizenship. And it's a very interesting literature that is starting to accumulate around this specific topic. So for that reason, then it seemed entirely entirely feasible and appropriate. So our proposal indicated that we would convene scholars who would discuss the ways that the president's administration had made good on the anti-immigrant policies proposed even starting during his campaign, and secondly, the collective strategies by which Latinos and Latinas were acting in response to their rights and who would defend what citizenship meant for them, or define what citizenship might mean for them. And of course, citizenship might seem like it's a straightforward concept, but if you do any kind of digging before you know it, you're caught in a very thick theoretical debate around just exactly what citizenship really means, and that's part of what it is that we've been talking about during this whole week. Well, as a matter of fact, it has been an exciting, vibrant discussion that we've been having this whole week. And we sit down to talk, and everybody pays attention, and everybody chimes in, and we've been having some dynamic debates, and it's all been on top of serious. It's all been very fun as well. What I would like to do is to have our participants stand and give a brief introduction, so that you can get to know who they are and their faces. Angela, you want to start since you're closest here?
Yeah, Angela Valenzuela, welcome. I'm faculty in cultural studies and also policy, education policy at the University of Texas, but I'm contributing to the volume, The Importance of Curriculum and Ethnic Studies as a part of Citizenship.
Tomas Jimenez, I'm an associate professor in sociology at Stanford University, and my chapter is about the changing demography of Mexican immigration and how that shapes the composition of the Mexican origin population.
Hi, I'm Cristina Beltran from New York University. I'm an associate professor in in politics, my field, but I'm in the department with Mary Renato in social and cultural analysis. And my chapter is looking at the politics of white nativism and sort of the relationship between how anti-Mexican sentiment sort of shapes how Trump supporters have a desire both for democracy for themselves, but a policy of kind of white racial terrorism for those who are not, who are non-white.
My name is Alicia Galvez. I'm a professor of Latin American and Latino Studies at Lehman College at the City University of New York. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I work mainly at the intersection of migration, health, and citizenship. But my chapter for this volume is on a different subject, which is the undocumented youth activism and how that relates to conceptualizations of citizenship.
Hi, my name is Adelie Zimmerman. I am assistant professor at Pomona College in Southern California. I'm a political scientist by training, but I'm in a Chicano Latino Studies department, and my contribution to the panel is focusing on the implications of Central American migration and how it's framed, and how that sort of impacts and shapes conceptions of Latino citizenship.
Good afternoon. My name is Matt Barreto. I am a professor of Chicano Studies and Political Science at UCLA, where we have no snow right now. I'm also a co-founder of a polling and research consulting firm called Latino Decisions, and the chapter I contribute is on the Latino participation and reaction in the 2018 election.
My name is David Montejano. I'm a professor at the graduate school at UC Berkeley. Previously, I was a professor of ethnic studies and history, and I've been working on trying to analyze the dynamics of nativism and nativist politics.
So that's our group.
I want to mention one thing. I don't know how we did this, but we don't have any assholes in there. And I thought every time we put 10 people together,
There's going to be one.
there's going to be one. And then one sociopath. And we don't have either. And the group is, we've just been having a lot of fun. It's been, Yeah, it's been a joyous thing for us, and a very rich discussion. Just people from different disciplines, different angles, and I'm very appreciative of the voter behavior, political scientist type people, because they've been speaking English to us in Spanish, but in very plain speak and engaging very fully with everybody. And I think one of the secrets is that there's been a very full engagement and a huge amount of trust and confidence in everybody's interlocutors, that nobody's out to score points. We have a sense of great urgency about figuring out what in the world is happening that's in this bizarre universe we've been thrust into. And there's been, well, we knew from the beginning, when we first decided to do this, we already knew by then that there was a witch hunt on, to coin a phrase, right? There was a witch hunt on, and we were the witches. And it was very clear from day one on the escalator, when the Donald proclaimed all Mexican immigrants were rapists, criminals, and so on. That was a touchstone. It was like we'd been put on notice. And so that was part of what motivated me to do this. I want to mention one other thing. I think back to 1969, 50 years ago. And at that time, we couldn't have done this. There was no base of scholarship. There weren't enough scholars to actually put something together of this kind. And that it's an amazing opportunity when you see that suddenly there's a very rich body of scholarship to draw on, and a very rich group of scholars to convene for the conversation. I'll mention two things about the scholars we chose. It's not an in-group, where we got a kind of cadre of people we had already formed around. It's some people we know well, others we know less well, but it's gelled into a rather amazing group. And one thing we did was we tried to get different disciplines, and we wanted people who would bring different things to the table. And we also did something incredibly hard to discern, but you probably have already caught on. We wanted half women and half men. And that's what we've got. And it really changes the dynamic in rich and wonderful ways. And we also wanted to get a lot of what we think of as emerging scholars, younger scholars, who aren't people who've been around the discipline for years and years and years, and whose work's already known, and whose steps are already familiar. And we want to see some new dances. And we got that. And it's been far better than we dared hope.
I should mention one participant who wasn't able to make it this week and worked with us on Skype. Her name is Minion. She's a assistant associate professor of history at Stanford University. And she's been doing research on US-bound Mexican immigration from the point of view of Mexico and Mexico's own internal policies.
Yes.
I just want to echo a couple of things that Renato mentioned, which is, yes, I'm going to thank SAR for their hosting us this week. It's been great. A special thanks goes to the staff over at the Schwartz Center, they have been very excellent in preparing our meals and in being there to serve our needs. And so we want to make sure that we convey that. And I think this type of seminar, I'm expecting is rather unusual for the School of Advanced Research. And I think that the school should be very highly commended for taking the step of allowing us to come together to talk about things that we will approach academically because that is our skill set, but which deals with events that are very momentous in this present time. And so our confidence is that we are going to come up with some highly original kinds of both academic and policy writings. And so we very much look forward to the next step in the process, which will be to put the papers together into a sound anthology that can make everyone involved and SAR proud. I want to acknowledge the role that Mary has been playing in this whole project. On paper, the co-conveners are Renato and I. But from the get-go, Mary has been there and she has contributed a whole lot to the success of the seminar. And so for that purpose then, Renato and I decided that we should make her a co-editor of the volume. That's how important her work has been to the success of the project. So we don't want to lay out a big tedium of stuff that we've been talking about this whole week. What we've done instead is that we have identified some major themes that have either been recurrent or are so important that they deserve mention. And so what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Mary so that she can start the process of stating what those themes are. Mary?
Okay, thank you. So we kind of came up with a list of 7 of the major kind of through lines or strands or topics that we've been keep coming back to in our conversations. And I'm going to lay those out briefly and then invite anyone to ask questions for further elaboration, and our scholars are all here to provide that. So of course, number 1 was the 2018 elections and the extraordinary impact in those elections of the Latino vote, and in particular the Mexican American vote. The fact that the Latino vote doubled in the elections, and the fact that of the 40 seats in Congress that were gained, 20 of those gains were due to the increased Latino vote. And so we've been fascinated by that, and also by our number cruncher, Matt Barreto, has given us research that shows very interesting dimensions of the voting patterns in 2018. For example, that across the board, there was a great deal of solidarity across categories of Latinos. So that Puerto Ricanos, Cubanos, everyone, Dominicanos, the Latino vote across the country all felt equally threatened by the threat to Mexican Americans at the border. No one felt like that's their problem, it's our problem. So there was a great sense of what Matt calls linked fate among across lines of Latino voters. That was a very important insight that he had, just to give you an example. The emergence of new racial formations in this and identities, and also the particulars of the new people who were elected, this new crop of young people who have come into Congress and come into public office, and the fact that they are introducing whole new vocabularies into the political process. They are very at ease talking about white supremacy, talking about gender questions, talking about patriarchy, talking about intersectionality. All these, they have these vocabularies and they own them. They are there, and that's going to change. It has already obviously changing the political discussion. You have a Green New Deal out there that was impossible. And that takes us back to a point I'll come back to later, which is curriculum, education, ethnic studies, and the production of political subjects through the educational process. So the second theme we have is that we spend a lot of time on history, as you can imagine. And we've been discussing both the recent history of the kind of persecution of Mexican Americans, the targeting of Mexican Americans in the US, and noticing a lot of parallels between the 1980s, things that came around in the 1980s after Reagan, and things that have been coming around under Trumpism. We're more talking about Trumpism than Trump. And that's been a kind of really interesting thing. So for example, David Montejano in his paper talked about the way that what Pete Wilson did in California in the 80s is now come back to haunt us with Trumpism. But in the 80s it was at the state level of California, and now the question of Mexicanismo, Mexican Americans, has become nationalized. Almost every town in the country now has a Mexican American population, and the attack on Mexicanos has become national through Trump's rhetoric of the wall.
So instead of being a regional minority, Mexicanos have become a national minority.
Which expands
Thanks
the
to
problem, but also expands the political power involved. And then we spent time discussing the much longer history of people of Mexican descent and origin in the Southwest, and the particularity of that history, that it is in part a history of one empire succeeding another, a history of colonialism, and in part a history of mass migration, and the kind of particularity of those dimensions, and at the same time the kind of long-term relentlessness of the persecution of Mexican Americans and the struggles that they have had.
And so one question in that regard is, what is it about being Mexican that, Mexican communities ended up being socially subordinated or structurally subordinated or placed in situations of inequality at the same time that they are ravaged by certain ideologies across time? And so, because I'm involved in this particular part of the process, I'm now thinking that is one of the things that we want to try to grapple with. What is it about being Mexican in relationship to the American mainstream that ends up with these kinds of conditions of inequality and social subordination?
Great. And also thinking about that as a component of American democracy. The history of Mexicans in the United States is also the history of democracy in the United States, and the way it has unfolded. Then, of course, the third thing was that you heard people mentioning was, what is white nativism? What is white nationalism? What forms it? What model of democracy does white nationalists envision for people? And that was where we've been working some with the model that Cristina Beltran mentioned, of a democracy in which the white population has democracy internally, but that democracy, its value and its composition is conditional on the subjugation and oppression of people of color. And so we've been thinking a lot about that model and the ways it explains, for example, the pleasure that you get, a white person can get from the performance of, from witnessing or the performance of cruelty on people of color. Because we've been thinking about all these
putting children in cages.
These politics of cruelty that we've been seeing, the public shootings of the children, the questions, things at the border, and small acts, YouTube footage of people on a bus just suddenly turning around and screaming at some immigrants. Those forms of microaggression that we're seeing are somehow built into this particular model of enacting this particular model of democracy. So that's one of the ways that we've been trying to contemplate white nativism and how it works as a force and how it recruits people. It's not something that so how it recruits people to its apparent structures of privilege.
Just for clarity's sake, the terms nativism and nationalism paired with white are not our terms. They're Trump's terms, and they're also, like Samuel Huntington's terms, people who've kind of produced this ideology, but they're not made up terms by us. They're terms that have been used by some of the main protagonists themselves.
We've gone back to Huntington, for example. Then another one, another theme is the forms of citizenship that immigrants bring with them or develop here that are not, that are in their particularities. So Arely Zimmerman has been working on Central American migrants, as she mentioned, and she notes, her research has shown that the immigrants from El Salvador, for example, who came here in the 80s in the aftermath of the guerrilla struggle there, brought with them certain ideas of citizenship that are connected not to kind of civil rights or a national paradigm, but to a kind of higher cause and civic and civic obligation and so on, and a revolutionary paradigm. And then that was one example that we had. And then
Mexican rural schooled people who were getting education based on the Mexican Revolution. And so I think we tend to think of the immigrants coming in as a blank slate.
Blank slate, yeah.
But in fact, they're fully formed, excuse me. They have ideas of what their civic obligations are, what their civic opportunities are, how they should be in relation to a state,
into a community.
And so that we're trying to flesh that out, both for readers and for ourselves.
And on that same topic, Alicia Gaudes has been working on undocumented youth and their movements and their forms of organization, and studying the kinds of the dreamers and the whole process by which the dreamers advance their cause by crafting stories that would make them valuable and acceptable to mainstream white Americans, and then their abandonment of that strategy when the DREAM Act failed, and their retreat into their move now into a quite radical sounding politics of refusal, where I will not tell my story, I will not be used as a symbol of anything, and so evolving strategies of citizenship that again are quite unique and distinctive and insert something new and different into our political mix. And a fifth theme has been what is the end of migration from Mexicanos going to mean in the United States? The Mexican population, Mexican American population has always been for a very long time replenished itself, and Tomás Jiménez has been studying this replenishment, and then what happens when that ends? And what happens to the Mexican American identities and politics here? And that's a really interesting open question.
And it has ended for who knows how long.
Yeah. And then a sixth focus that's been very important and revealing to us is the importance of ethnic studies and the struggles over ethnic studies and the victories that have been celebrated in ethnic studies. So the whole intervention, very violent suppression of ethnic studies in Tucson at high schools was the battlefront for this. And
let me mention, it's very painful to me as a graduate of Tucson High.
And Ángela Valenzuela was a participant in that legal struggle, and a very important factor in producing the victory in which the ethnic studies curriculum has been reinstated in Tucson. And we're very aware of the importance that ethnic studies in particular and that curriculum in general has in producing our political agents in this country and our leaders. And in particular, we've been seeing the importance of K through 12 education, and also outside of the school education that really works to decolonize learning, and to some people working with interacting, for example, between indigenous models of knowledge to look for new forms of knowledge that are going to be particularly important in relation to climate change. And finally, and to just social sanity in general. And finally, we've had some really great conversations about what is the role of academics and scholars and activists now. And in particular, as scholars, we're faced constantly with the question of how do we avoid getting trapped by Trumpism in the contestatory role, where we spend all our time and energy correcting the lies, contesting the mistakes, and which ends up talking back. And
We think of it as going down the rabbit hole.
And it feels like going down a rabbit hole where then it becomes, where do you have the time and energy to develop alternative political imaginaries, to develop strategies that are going to work? And because all that talking back doesn't always make much of a difference if nobody cares what the facts are anyway, right? So how do you change the conversation, reground it, so that you're not just in that contestatory mode, and you're also not constantly in the position of trying to satisfy the concerns of some gaze that's coming at you from somewhere else, that's assigning you your value from somewhere else.
And you're putting forward a positive vision of what we'd like society to be, or what we'd like to have a debate or discussion about what our democracy could be, and we don't want to lose that.
And discussions that are grounded in our own historical experience and our own creative imagination. So that's kind of one of the challenges that we're trying to figure out. That's it. That's the big 7 for today. So we invite now audience members to take up any of these threads, and we have our scholars here. Yeah.
I just want to emphasize that this is a critical scholarship that's going on here, and I may be the only paranoid one around here, and sometimes there are other things that, we don't have any a-holes in this group. Sometimes I try my best to play the role.
Get a day job.
So all these folks are steeped in their disciplines and in their literatures, and they use that in order to construct their papers. Okay, so we can open it up for questions now.
Oh, I like silence. Great. Oh, it's lovely.
So you mentioned that the recent polling of one of your participants shows that Latinos from different, Dominicans, Cuban Americans, Puerto Ricans actually do share a high level of solidarity in response to the current situation. But that, in my understanding, is that's a different picture from, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, where, for example, Cuban Americans tend to be much more conservative than Mexican Americans. So what's your, can you bring a little bit more texture to that statement and give us a sense of where you think that's going?
Matt, you're on.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I think that's generally right. I would say probably push it back closer to 10 years. We've really seen this sort of increase in solidarity in what we call linked fate, increasing since the 2006 marches, which were in response to the Sensenbrenner bill that would have nationally criminalized any assistance at all to anyone who was not authorized to be in the United States, including churches, schools, just giving someone a ride. So that was HR 4437, and then there were a number of marches in the early spring and through the late spring of 2006. At that time, we started to see an increase in solidarity for those marches, those immigrant rights marches, and then we continued to see it grow in response to Arizona's SB 1070, where we had previously seen differentiation by generation, but 1070 was, again, it was viewed as being a racial profiling bill, that it wasn't really targeting undocumented immigrants, it was targeting anyone with an accent or who looked a certain way, which was uncovered in the lawsuit that, in fact, that's how they wrote the bill, and behind the scenes, they were exchanging emails to that extent. And then coming forward to today, I think we've seen a further increase in people feeling that it wasn't just Mexican immigrants who were being identified and being attacked during the campaign, but all Latin American immigrants or all Latinos in the US. Of course, we had the infamous remarks about Judge Gonzalo Curiel, who's US born, Mexican American, and was similarly racialized. And then we've seen the extension to Central Americans in the migrant caravan being called an invasion, being called animals. We saw the treatment of Puerto Ricans during Maria. So as we've been researching this, we've been slowly seeing just an increase in that perceived solidarity, which was present, we think, in the 2018 election.
What about the religious dimension? I mean, as you know, in Central and South America, the evangelical conversion is really a powerful social force, and that has led to some fragmentation of Latino voting patterns in the United States. Where do you think that's going right now?
So what I think is happening is that this really overt and strong racialization that is happening is overriding everything. That you can be a more conservative evangelical, but if you're called, you know, a Central American, and if you're being racialized as an animal, not even being dehumanized, your religion is irrelevant at that point. The way that you're viewing your connection to other Latin American immigrants and other Latinos in the U.S. So there's still, you know, certainly diversity within the Latino community. There's no question, and Cubans continue to vote. Split about 50-50 Democrat-Republican. But we're just seeing an increase in that, and the point of our research was that it was not only being felt by Mexican Americans, it was being most strongly felt by Mexican Americans, but that others, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Salvadorans, et cetera, also felt this racialization in 2016.
I would just add something really quickly too. I think that I think one of the things that's been really exciting about this gathering of folks together is that we all draw on each other's research, and we have an enormous respect for each other's work. But we're also in dialogue and debate with each other. And so there also is debate about, do we make the emphasis more on, say, the cohesion of populations and racialization, and how anti-Mexican, anti-Latino sentiment has shaped these dynamics. But also, we're also collectively trying to contend with the fact that 20 to 25% of Latinos vote Republican, right? And that's a pretty core group. And so who are they, and what's that story about? They're a minority, and so sometimes the press gets very man bites dog about the Mexican with a Trump hat on, right? Who's clearly a minority, but also represents a significant portion of people. So trying to make sense of how Mexican American and Mexican identity is moving in multiple ways simultaneously. And so I think one thing this volume is really trying to do is to get a sense of that simultaneity of motions in different directions, because that's all happening at the same time. And the other thing I would add to that is, it also is a story right now of white identity moving in multiple directions, right? So just as certain white citizens are being hailed into a certain form of nativism, we've also been talking a lot about how other white, Anglo-Americans are also becoming increasingly appalled by this behavior, and it's politicizing them in a different direction, in a kind of anti-racist logic. Right, where people are from, we're reading a lot of research on intermarriage, and so there's a lot of dynamics emerging simultaneously, and I think making sense of this political terrain, a big part of that is trying to assess all of that, and that's producing interesting dialogues and debates within our own group, which I think has been really exciting, because we're trying to sort of figure out, like, how can all these things be equally true when you're dealing with a population of something like 57 million people. So for us to expect homogeneity from 57 million folks is already, plus different undocumented populations, is already kind of insane. So we're trying to sort of make sense of that collectively.
Let me add one thing on the evangelicals. If you've ever been to a Latino or Mexican American evangelical service, it don't look like the regular white evangelical service. And so we need a concept that I'm sure you're deeply familiar with, syncretism, right? And to see how the blend is working. And I think one thing that happens is that when people hear about all the people who are becoming evangelicals, we can all too easily assume we know what that looks like. But we don't until we do a little field work. See what the world is going on here. And how did these people become born again, this and that? We just have to look at it a little more carefully. But it's definitely a phenomenon, and I think one that's not well studied yet, and needs study.
Yes.
I am very appreciative of the last of the 7 themes that you said are emerging, and I'm interested in whether there are themes that have begun to emerge in your group about what you want to pursue that would be in a creative, optimistic, humanitarian direction rather than being organized by contesting something that I believe is more hateful and fearful. What do you want to say?
Michelle, do you want to take that one?
Is Michelle there?
Michelle,
She didn't come.
Oh, she's not here. Who would, if you?
I think we, yeah.
David, did you, I'm sorry.
Angela, yeah, perfect.
Yes, the answer is yes.
Next.
Thank you, Annika.
Well, and so like in a lot of the decolonial, the post-colonial literature, one direction that it goes is towards what is called the decolonial imaginary. And whether it's something like, that we work for politically and it's maybe in the distant future, or whether it's something that we enact right now, right? I mean, we can enact it right now if we subscribe to ways of knowing that are communitarian, that are non-hierarchical, that are respectful, that actually take a really more sort of a deeper dive into our own inheritances as mestizos and indigenous peoples of this continent. And I think an important part of that is also just like standing our ground. And I mean, we're not going anywhere. We're not from any continent. Even if we're blended and mixed, even if our genes traveled all over the continent and the universe, our people stayed, right? We're still here, and there's nowhere to go back to, right? And so I'm really interested in, just to continue the conversation, in how these emergent forms of citizenship among Central Americans and Central American intellectuals and South American intellectuals, how they speak to a different epistemology, a new way of knowing that is in fact grounded. We're talking about re-territorializing. So these ideologies that are like kind of up here, that are oppressive and top down, they don't have any, there's no grounding for them. They come from another place. They're not from here, right? And so I have enormous hope and optimism in what the descendants of the peoples of this continent have to offer this sort of new world in terms of our own ways of knowing that are authentic and humanitarian, and that are really premised in these notions of respect that we've thought of as coming from the Spanish, because it's expressed in the Spanish language. But I think a deeper investigation would locate them actually in the ways of knowing of the peoples of this land, whose voices I think are now beginning to be heard.
Let me mention one thing. I feel very uncomfortable sitting up here separate from the other participants.
Yes.
And it's really uncomfortable, and we've all been operating in a circle, a physical circle. There's been nobody at the head of the table, nobody in a separate space up here. We've worked very hard to be speaking and thinking and processing all this from positions of equality. And the circle is part of what Angela's talking about, that's a preferred form, right? And we've delivered, the space provided here allowed for that, but we set up the chairs.
Yeah. And if I could add something real quick to Angela's point, that these visions, we don't have to wait for them. They're being enacted as we speak, right? And I think Alicia's paper was great at pointing out that young people, they might not be doing anything new, right? Or they might be reinventing, sort of ways in which people have resisted, right? And incorporating into their new strategies. But our group has really talked quite a bit, obviously, about electoral politics, because that's where a lot of our energies right now have to go. We have to defend that frontier in terms of our foundational institutions, and our right to vote. That who knew we were going to be back here, right? Defending that right. But I think I take heart in the social movements on the ground. Like Alicia's paper, speak a little bit to the inventive and creative ways that undocumented youth, without really a lot of resources or capital, social capital, political capital, were able to make the immigrant rights movement and their perspective on that a national one, you know, and you know, we have to be heartened by that, and those youth now 10 years later now are the ones, or many of them are deeply embedded in aiding Central American refugees, you know, and even though they can't actually, it's dangerous for them to go near the border, or they can't even cross borders, but they're figuring out ways, you know, new ways of linking up and building coalitions with the Central American refugees, going to detention centers. You know, undocumented youth used to, you know, they were engaging in infiltrating ICE detention centers, doing hunger strikes, and you see Central American mothers doing, you know, engaging in hunger strikes, right? Writing letters saying, this is our plight right now, linking up to the outside world. So I think we're seeing, we don't need to wait, right, to enact that vision. It's being enacted right now, and I think as scholars, we've kind of thought about how our work links up and engages with those movements, right, and are part of the same kind of political project. You know, if that makes sense. If you want to say
Yeah, well, I think you put it better than I could, but I think also building on what you said, I think a lot of what informs our work is that inductive approach of really learning from what we're seeing and trying to take lessons from what's happening, and not coming in with kind of preconceived hypotheses for things. And so I think that approach is allowing us to learn from the people that are, you know, driving a lot of these social movements and pushing for new visions, whether it's new visions of organizing education or new visions of organizing politics, ideas about citizenship, and taking our cue from youth and from migrants and from different coalitions that are in many ways already pointing past the current moment to a larger conversation about our democracy, and I think that that's really important. So to speak to specifically to the undocumented youth who I'm focusing on in my paper, a lot of them are no longer actively engaging in lobbying for their own protection, the DREAM Act or whatever. They've stopped doing that work, and they're really thinking about collaborating with Black Lives Matter and Native activists like at Standing Rock, and thinking about ways to expand the conversation about what does citizenship mean? Is rights based on telling a story that convinces people case by case that this, you know, community is worthy of respect, or is it about larger conversation about what is democracy and what is it, how to make it real?
John has a question.
This might get me in trouble, I hope not. I'm interested, you know, I think Latino studies, ethnic studies, sociology, anthropology, humanistic social sciences in general are in this really interesting place where we're trying to really kind of figure out what to term something. Is it Latinx? Is it Latino? Is it Chicano? Is it Mexican American? And there are a lot of tensions with all of that. And I'm sort of thinking of some of the papers that have dealt with sort of organizing and collective action, if whether or not any of those terms of that nomenclature is actually a pulling force or sort of something that's more separating and disaggregating people. And I think, and that might be for more like Alicia, Natalie, and Christina or Matt, but I think also thinking about the larger 7 themes, whether or not the future of all of this work you see becoming more pan-Latino, however that's termed. And I feel like there are differentiations here with sort of, you know, generational status, citizenship status, all those things. And I think the point I'm trying to make here is, as Mexicanness, Latinidad, however we term it, I feel even as scholars we vacillate, and we intersperse this, and we'll write a paper and we'll go back, and I'm like I said, oh, Latino, Latina, X here, Mexican, uh-oh, it's all something different. But that's a thought that I've been rolling with for a while.
For those who, a little background here, that the term Mexican American isn't grammatically marked for gender, right? But Latino, Latina, if you use the term Latino, you have to use the Spanish gender marker, either O for masculine, A for feminine, right? And so the question is, how do you know, grammatical gender is a huge problem. I wish we would just get rid of all the languages that have it, but then of course, that would be the entire Indo-European system, I think. Anyhow, but so what's evolved is a strategy of putting an X where that A or O is, and pronouncing it Latin X. And this is the thing that makes somebody like me uncomfortable. Like, well, wait a minute, that you can't pronounce that in Spanish. But I was recently at a colloquium on ecology in Buenos Aires, and in Spanish, people were saying Latinx. That was the word would be. It had been incorporated into the Spanish.
And that's kind of funny because they should be saying Latinx.
X, right? So it's like in English instead of immigrants saying emigre. Right? But anyway, that's what is being asked about. There's a lot of turbulence right now in the nomenclature in what term you use. So for some people would write Latina with the at sign in there. That was the A inside the O. That was one way of doing it. And there's always Latina/O or Latino. In Bolivia, they have a rule now, and since they had a democratic revolution there, that you have to say both words. So you have to say compañeros y compañeras, or compañeras y compañeros, bolivianos y bolivianos. You have to do both. And so there's a constant reduplication in the public discourse. So anyway, that's the terminological issue that John's bringing up.
The one thing I'll say, John, and I'll let you, but is I'm not made uncomfortable by that ambiguity, and I'm very inspired by Christina's work, so I'm going to defer to her, but I just feel like we can never take terms for granted, and that they're always in contention. And so for me, it's a great thing to have to question. You know, I remember in the 90s saying Latino with the Aruba. Aruba was like radical or something, you know. But I think in all of these political, in all of these contentious, you know, struggles that our terms reflect, it's just important in terms of what you said about the pan-Latino thing. Just to always, for me, it always has to be grounded in kind of a critical race approach. You know, that's important to me, and that's the history or the legacy of Chicano studies, and to always, you know, have that center, because that experience was central, right? And so as I approach, you know, Central American studies, critical race theory, Chicano studies, Chicano feminism is really foundational, right, to how I approach the other things. But I don't think we can take those things for granted, is my point. And especially because people identify in different ways. So anyways, Christina and Tomas.
Oh, no, I would just say really quickly, I mean, I'm wrestling with this too. I'm finishing a book right now, and I'm like, do I say Latinx? Do I do, and I think about the way that, like, I move between African American and Black. So I think about that question, and I think what's good is we're sort of past the name wars. I think in the 70s there were like fights about, are you Chicano or are you this? And it was like, you had to choose, you know, there really was a kind of policing around in different kinds of spaces. In other spaces people were like, what are Chicanos, right? So I think there's also really interesting class issues here, because I appreciate Latinx for breaking down the gender binary. And I think that's really powerful for people who don't identify across the gender binary. On the other hand, I think about, like, my tia does not know what Latinx means. So it is a word that has, it's circulating among certain institutions, certain universities. It's generational. And so, I think it's a really interesting question of, I think now though we have to sort of, I think Arely is exactly right. We have a moment we have to sort of stop and say, this is the language I'm using, here's why. But it's always political. I mean, my family's from New Mexico, or my mom's family is, and, you know, Hispano, right? I mean, these terms exist and they cross in different parts of the country, in different regions, in different states, so it's just always a challenge, it really is.
My personal opinion is anytime you can put an X in a word, you should, because it's cool. My last name's Jimenez, and you can spell Jimenez with an X, and I wish it were, but it's spelled with a J. Just I might change it. No, and another theme that has emerged in the last 3 days is that Christina and I agree on a lot. And so I would just underscore the importance of differentiating between debates that we have in grad seminar rooms and in the academy with the kind of labels people are using in their everyday lives, and that we not get so hung up on the terminology that we lose sight of what I think is actually an important empirical question as a sociologist, a social scientist, which is, what do people call themselves, and more importantly, what does that mean to them? I did a study in rural Kansas and compared that with a city in Central Coast of California, and this would come up, and people in Kansas say, use the term Hispanic all the time. And I would ask what that means. They say Hispanic, Mexican, Mexican American, it's all the same. There was really no sense of pan-ethnicity because there were very few non-Mexican Latinos, Hispanics, Latinxes in the city, and then if you go to the California city where there are also very few Mexicans but a very different political history, people say, I never want to call myself Hispanic. That's a term the government gave us. I don't want that term. We're Mexican. So anyway, I think the question you pose is actually an empirical question that's worth researching. And the upshot, and I get asked this often when I talk to kind of civic organizations, League of Women Voters or the Kiwanis Club, and people ask about terminology. I think the short answer is we don't know. We don't know what to call ourselves.
And I think it's also situational. It's in context. I'm a Latina, others I'm a Tejana, right? But I think there's also there's also, I think a larger kind of question or framing is that, within Mexican American, Chicano, Latino studies, it's not, like it's sort of a monolith or an ideology. What it is like a space where we can actually have these, these very critical kinds of discussions.
So there's a William and then.
I think we have time just for one more question.
How about we just take both of them and
Two for one.
respond?
Let's do it.
Two things. It's interesting about this exit, just quickly, because also I think it's important to recognize temporality. Like I like the idea that, I was revising an article from the person was using Latinx for something in the 1930s, in 1800s. And it's complicated because I say, well, the battalion did not understand themselves in those terms. So it's also interesting it's a complicated thing because you will use Latino, Latinx, all these kind of things, Hispanic, multiple. But also it helps us to recognize how power has been constructed during the time. And it's important to say, like, in that moment, in the Chicano movement, it was a Chicano movement. And it was not into this moment that people said, because it's also, they don't take this transformation in the conscience that really. That's one thing. The other question, I have more to do about the LGBTQ issue. How is that working in the article? Because I do remember, for example, going to a gay bar in LA, and I feel that was a space where citizenship was constructed, because as a gay man, it was expected some behavior that it was not necessarily what it meant for me to be Latino. So it was all this tension about what is a gay Latino bar where we can go. So it was an interesting thing. I think so. I think Roque Ramirez, did a lot of that kind of work with San Francisco in this kind of how citizenship is so constructed, but these norms of sexual performance and how it's expected, this, for example, be gay mean this, be joto mean this, be maricon mean this. So it's an interesting, so not necessarily that you guys need to deal with, but it calling to my attention, like, oh my goodness, we were dealing with these other questions, even though we didn't know that was what happened,
Yeah, and I'll be there at the reception later, so we'll be talking as well, but this might be out of the 7 points, but we're looking at solidarity and alliances, but also the tensions within our communities, right? Yeah. So I don't know if you all talk about like the anti-Indigenous or anti-Central American sentiments that exist within the Mexican community, because even when we contest these terms like Latino, that's a European-based identity, right? A lot of Indigenous folks don't identify with Hispanic or Latino for that reason, right? So I'm Maya, and I identify as Latino strategically, right? So I don't know if that's something that you all talk about already within your work with Central American issues, if you all touch on that. I know there's not that much time to be talking about this later, but I was just kind of curious about that as well.
We've talked a lot about how within any identity group, there will be always, these kind of tensions often around who's more greater or lesser authenticity, and hierarchies get constructed within ethnicities around these issues of language competence, that kind of stuff, and so you can't ever imagine an ethnic group is homogeneous in that way.
And just to add, a lot of our discussions are really, can both of these things exist at the same time? In other words, can we see these broader national trends that are responding to this external kind of threat of like, you know, this broader racialization. But that doesn't mean that, you know, within communities and the ways in which people talk every day about, that those are things that are relational and contextual and that are constantly changing to certain, you know, inputs. And so I've been working through that myself because there is evidence of, obviously, of pan identity, Latinidad and all this, and yet that doesn't help explain, you know, what has happened in the last few years in terms of this kind of the ways in which people are talking about Central American, you know, and about indigenous folks, you know, using very racialized terms, and in which that kind of immigrant solidarity, you're not seeing that. Well, I'm an immigrant, you're an immigrant. You're seeing, we came here the right way, or, you know, don't, you know, you're abusing the asylum, you know, system. You're seeing all of these things come into play. So.
Yeah, I was just saying, Ana Minion, who's here, Skyped in, I think is talking about this from the Mexican side really, really productively and powerfully. And I think that the other thing I would say is I think there was a former member of SAR, Laura Gomez, who was here. You know, the fact that Mexicans are both a subjugated population and played a role in settlement and being settlers. And to really reckon with that complicated identity, right? I think is something that Latinx studies is still really only beginning to have a conversation about. And I think it's a really necessary side of research that is, you know, Josie Saldaña Portillo's book, Indian Given, is a space for that. But there's only Simón Trujillo, there's a beginning of a set of voices, I think, really doing this work that's at the intersection of Native studies and Latinx studies, and we need so much more of it to reckon with that side of the story. We're just beginning to talk about it.
And I remember after the MAGA, the response was "Make America Mexico Again." And people were like, "Well, what about going over?"
Yeah. But yeah, we need a bigger hat.
You see the nature of the fun that we're having.
Yeah.
I'm going to say the final word here. Let's hope that the controversy over the controversy over the Cuarón movie Roma.
Right.
Let's hope that that ends up with a positive result. And more Mexicanos growing more conscious of regarding their racism against indigenous.
Well, thank you. I
want to thank the audience for coming. Everyone who's here is wanting to learn something, and I wish more Americans wanted to learn. I also apologize for dividing the circle. I hope you can reform it. We all value a circular form of thinking, and I know that those of you who were not up here, but we just, for the sake of expediency and having a focus for our audience, we needed a little bit more closure. So thank you, participants, for coming. I hope you can continue to speak a little with some of our resident scholars over here, and I think that's really great.